10-year-old boy stood on a sun-drenched Liverpool street in 1964, busking with his prized guitar, completely unaware that 4 black cars were pulling up behind him, and inside those cars were the 4 men who wrote the very song trembling from his fingertips. When John Lennon stepped out first and the boy's hands froze mid-chord, what happened next would be captured in the memories of everyone on that street, a moment so raw and unexpected that it would change not just the boy's life, but reveal something about the Beatles that no screaming concert crowd would ever witness. But what did the Beatles do in those few unguarded minutes that made this random street encounter more legendary than any stadium performance? And what did John whisper to that kid that he carried with him for the rest of his life? Afternoon sunlight bathed Matthew Street in warm light, the pavement dry and bright. Shop fronts gleamed behind clean windows, and the street hummed with the easy energy of a summer afternoon. Liverpool in July 1964 carried the weight of its own mythology now. This was the street where it all began, where 4 lads who couldn't afford proper equipment had played basement clubs until their fingers bled and their voices went raw. But those days felt archaeological now, buried under screaming headlines and American television appearances and the machine of something that had grown too big to call a band anymore. The boy stood on the wide pavement near the Cavern Club, an open guitar case at his feet, catching the occasional coin from passers-by. He was maybe 10 years old in denim overalls over a white shirt, hair neatly combed but falling forward as he concentrated on the fretboard of a guitar showing signs of loving use. All 6 strings gleamed in the afternoon light. The sunburst finish caught the sun. The wood showed some wear but was clearly well maintained. He played She Loves You the way drowning men grab driftwood, desperately, imperfectly, as though his survival depended on those 6 strings. People walked past without looking. A woman in a headscarf stepped around him as though he were furniture. A man in a flat cap tossed a coin that clattered into the gutter and stayed there, unwanted. He didn't stop playing. His eyes were closed now, lips moving silently, forming words everyone in England knew by heart, but that clearly meant something different when you sang them to yourself on a bright street corner that smelled like coffee and fresh bread from nearby shops. His voice was barely a whisper, cracking on the high notes, but he pushed through anyway, committed to finishing what he'd started even though nobody was listening. The street buzzed with activity. Shopkeepers served customers through open doors. A bus rumbled past, splashing through a puddle that sent dirty water cascading across the curb. He shifted his stance, adjusting his grip on the guitar, and started the song again from the beginning, because he hadn't gotten it right yet. Because perfection felt like something that might save him from whatever waited at home, from the cramped flat with the broken heating, and the father who drank too much, and the mother who worked double shifts and still couldn't make the numbers add up. The guitar was his pride, saved for over months with birthday money and odd jobs around the neighbourhood. The boy taught himself 3 chords from a library book, and those 3 chords had become a language more fluent than anything he'd learned in school. In the distance the sound emerged before the shape did, the low rumble of engines, expensive and official, the kind that didn't belong on Matthew Street unless something important was happening. Black cars, 3 of them, moving with the slow gravity of funeral processions or royal visits. His fingers stumbled over a chord change, eyes opened halfway, squinting toward the approaching vehicles, then looked back down at his guitar. Whatever was coming wasn't for him. Nothing ever was. He bent closer to the strings, to that well-worn wood and all 6 strings, and played louder, harder, as though trying to drown out the sound of the world that had learned to ignore him. The cars kept coming, their polished black paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The gap between them was closing. Something was about to collide with something else, and the street itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when 2 different kinds of desperation would meet in the same 4 bars of music. Inside the lead car, John Lennon stared out the tinted window and watched Liverpool scroll past, a film he'd already seen too many times. His cigarette burned down to the filter, unnoticed. Paul sat beside him, rubbing his temples in small circles, the gesture of a man 20 years older than 22, while George occupied the opposite seat in complete silence, head tilted back, eyes closed, but unmistakably awake. Ringo tried a joke about the crowds, something about needing lifeboats to get through the fans, but it landed in dead air, and he didn't try another. They were coming home, which should have meant something. Liverpool was supposed to be the place where they could breathe, where the machinery of Beatlemania might pause long enough for them to remember who they'd been before the screaming started. But Brian Epstein scheduled this appearance with military precision. Motorcade route planned to the minute, security briefings, crowd control strategies, the whole apparatus designed to move them from car to building, to stage to car again, without ever actually touching the city they came from. Paul mentioned wanting to see his family, to walk down Forthlin Road like a normal person, maybe grab a pint at the pub where nobody knew his face yet. John laughed at that, the bitter kind that wasn't really about humour, and said something cruel about Paul still believing in fairy tales. The truth was they couldn't hear their own music anymore. Not really. Every concert was a wall of screaming that started before the first note and didn't stop until they'd been hustled back into cars like this one, ears ringing, throats raw from shouting lyrics into microphones that couldn't compete with 15,000 voices determined to drown them out. George had stopped doing interviews where journalists asked him to explain the phenomenon, because how do you explain that the thing you loved most has been turned into something you can barely recognise? The song still existed somewhere, in recording studios, in the careful architecture of harmonies and arrangements, but live performance had become a kind of pantomime, a ritual where four men pretended to play music while an audience pretended to listen. The motorcade slowed. Paul looked up. Traffic, or fans, or both. The usual chaos that followed them everywhere. Inescapable as weather. John took another drag and stared at the buildings sliding past, the familiar architecture of a childhood that felt like someone else's memory now. And then, through the glass and the engine noise and the distant roar of gathering crowds, they heard it. Acoustic guitar, off-key and struggling but unmistakable. Their song, their actual song, played the way songs are supposed to be played, by someone who needed it. All four of them went still. The car drifted to a complete stop on Matthew Street, and through the window they could see him. 10 years old maybe, bent over a guitar playing She Loves You, as though his survival hung on every chord. John's first cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. Paul leaned forward, George opened his eyes, and Ringo said what they were all thinking. Christ, that's us. That's what we sounded like. A crowd had gathered on both sides now, pressing closer with growing excitement, but none of the four Beatles were looking at the fans against the car windows with their photographs and lipstick-smeared pleas. They were looking at him, still playing where he stood, still lost in whatever private world the music had opened up for him, completely unaware that the architects of that world were sitting 20 feet away watching him fumble through their chord changes with a devotion that made something in John's chest tighten in a way he didn't have words for. The security man in the front seat barked into a radio, rapid-fire instructions about crowd control and alternate routes, his voice tight with the professional anxiety of a man responsible for keeping 4 people alive through a mob that loved them enough to tear them apart. But John didn't listen. He watched the boy's fingers, clean but still learning, too small for the fretboard, struggling to make the shapes that John himself had struggled to make on his first guitar, back when music was still something you did because you loved it, not because a schedule told you to. Paul's hand was on the door handle. George's seatbelt was already unbuckled. Ringo was leaning forward between the front seats, staring at the kid as though viewing a photograph of himself from another lifetime. John opened the car door. The security man twisted around, arm outstretched, mouth forming the beginning of a protest that died when he saw John's face. Paul followed before anyone could stop him, then George, then Ringo. 4 of them standing on Matthew Street in their expensive suits and their exhaustion and their fame, and the crowd that screamed their names went silent in a confusion so profound it felt like the air pressure had changed, because they weren't moving toward the venue. They weren't waving or smiling or performing any of the gestures that fans expected. They were walking toward a kid nobody had noticed until that moment, and the disconnect between what should be happening and what was happening created a pocket of stillness that spread outward in concentric ripples. The boy opened his eyes mid-chord. His fingers stopped moving, but the final note hung in the air, vibrating through all 6 strings and the well-worn wood, and for a suspended moment he was just looking at 4 silhouettes backlit by afternoon sun, 4 shapes that his brain couldn't quite process because the possibility was too enormous to fit inside the architecture of his understanding. Then recognition struck, sudden and ice-cold. The guitar slipped in his hands, but he caught it, the coins in his open case rattling as his hands shook, and he clutched it against his chest as a shield as the colour drained from his face so completely he looked like he might faint. John reached him first. He didn't crouch. That came a second later after he'd looked down at this shaking boy whose trembling made the guitar buzz. But when he did crouch, when he brought himself down to eye level with the boy where he stood, his voice came out quieter than it had in months. Stripped of the performance and the sarcasm and the armour he'd learned to wear against the world that wanted pieces of him. That was our song, wasn't it? The boy tried to speak, but nothing came out except a sound like air leaving a tyre. He nodded instead, once sharp and desperate. He dropped the spent cigarette, ground it out with his heel, and didn't look away from the kid's face. "You play it better than we do these days," he said, and it wasn't a joke. Paul was already kneeling beside John, hands outstretched in the universal gesture of musicians asking permission to touch another musician's instrument. The boy held the guitar tighter for a second, then released it as though entrusting something sacred. Paul took it with the same reverence, turning it over in his hands, fingers running across the strings and the worn finish that told stories Paul couldn't know but could imagine. He plucked one string, winced, started tuning with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd tuned 1,000 guitars in 1,000 venues. Except this time his hands weren't shaking from exhaustion, and his jaw wasn't tight from the pressure of staying on schedule and getting to the next city before the machinery of fame ground them into dust. George moved in on the other side, kneeling down beside the boy with an ease that made him look younger than he was, less worn down by the thing they'd all been running from, unspoken. He reached for the frozen left hand, locked in a chord shape that was almost right but not quite, and gently repositioned his fingers on the fretboard. "Like this, yeah?" His voice was soft, northern, stripped of performance. "You've got the instinct. Just need the shape." His fingers trembled under George's guidance, but he held the position, staring at his own hand as though it had betrayed him by not knowing what to do until this moment. Ringo crouched behind them all, one hand on the boy's shoulder, tapping out rhythm against the denim of his overalls. "You've got the beat, lad. That's the hard part. Most people can't find it no matter how many lessons they take. But you've got it. Don't lose that." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't technical enough, wasn't the kind of drummer serious musicians respected, until he became the backbone of the biggest band in the world and learned that technical perfection meant nothing compared to feel. John struck a match, lit a second cigarette and stood, but he didn't step back. He stayed close, looking down at this tableau that felt like something out of a memory he hadn't lived yet. 3 of them clustered around a kid who represented everything they'd been before the screaming started, before the money and the movies and the machinery that had turned 4 musicians into 4 products. "We started just like you," he said, smoke curling from his mouth into the warm Liverpool air. "Right here, same streets, same desperation. Same stupid hope that music might mean something." He paused, looked at the crowd still frozen in confusion, then back at the boy. "Don't let them take the music from you. When it gets big, when people start screaming and you can't hear yourself anymore, when every bastard with a suit wants a piece of what you've built, don't let them take the part that matters. This part. Right here. The part where it's just you and the guitar and the song." Paul handed the instrument back, but not before pulling a pen from his jacket pocket and signing his name across the body in quick, efficient script. George took the pen next, then Ringo, then finally John, who wrote his name larger than the others, a signature that took up half the guitar's face as though claiming territory, or leaving evidence or both. The boy held it as though it might evaporate. One wrong breath away from awakening and discovering this had all been the kind of dream Liverpool kids had when they fell asleep to Radio Luxembourg and imagined futures that seemed impossible. They stood, all 4 of them, the spell breaking but not entirely broken. John took one last drag, dropped the cigarette, met the boy's eyes one more time. The crowd began to remember how to breathe, how to move, how to scream. Security was pushing forward, hands on the Beatles' backs, voices urgent about schedules and safety. But in those final seconds before they turned away, Paul squeezed the boy's shoulder. George nodded as though they'd concluded a transaction that mattered. Ringo winked, and John said, quiet enough that only the kid could hear it, "You'll do all right. Better than us, probably." They returned to the car. The doors closed. The motorcade moved on, leaving behind exhaust and confusion, and a boy standing on the pavement holding a guitar that was now worth more than his father made in a year, tears streaming down his face, the signed wood blurring in his vision. The crowd surged forward, trying to understand what had just happened, but none of them had been close enough to hear the words, to see the tenderness, to witness four men stepping out of their own mythology, long enough to remember what they'd loved before the love became a cage. Years later, the boy, grown now with children of his own, would keep that guitar in a glass case in his living room. He never sold it, though collectors offered amounts that would have changed his life. He taught his daughter to play on a different guitar, but sometimes he'd take down the signed one and hold it, running his fingers across those four names, and tell the story of the day the Beatles stopped being Beatles long enough to be human. The strings had been replaced multiple times over the years, but the signatures remained, and the memory remained, and the lesson remained. That the only thing worth protecting in art was the moment before it became anything other than love.